Right, make a start. Right, how's everyone doing? Welcome back to English. It's been a while, hasn't it? It's been what, 6, 7 weeks now. I hope everyone's had a really nice summer. Um, I thought I'd leave a little starting activity on today, based on some of the keywords or the sort of new words that we learned last year. Because I decided this year I want to focus more on new words. I really want to start bolstering your vocabulary. So I thought I'd leave this on as a little 2-minute activity, try and fill them in, and then we'll make a proper start. And I'll put the answers on the next slide. And try and remind yourselves without looking at your notes. Right. I know it's only been a minute, but how is everyone getting on with this? Hopefully, you should be familiar with these words for now. I just want to make it also clear that I know last year I began to toe the line a little bit between these sessions, between the Key Stage 3 and the Key Stage 4 stuff. But this year, I'm going to try my absolute best to keep the first hour as being Key Stage 3 specific. So it's going to be topics that are more geared towards year 7 and 8 specifically, whereas our second hour is going to be years 9 to 10. So if you're here from year 9 to 10, you're welcome to stay, but it might be a little easy for you. But again, you're welcome to stay if you think it would be helpful. So I'll put on the answers, and you should hopefully be getting full marks because you'll have revised over the summer because you're keen, and I know you are. Um, and just as a quick revision, these are most, I think, not all of the new words that I gave you to learn. And I challenge you this year to learn as many new words as possible, because come your exams in a few years' time, one of the things you get marked on is your range and sophistication of your vocabulary. And these words are a great start and a great fit into many story types. So if you weren't here last year and you're new, welcome. I'd take a picture of these and learn as many as you want because throughout the year, I'm going to keep cropping back to these. So beware of that. Take a picture now. You're welcome to have them. These are just some that I introduced you to last year. I will keep going back to them, so have them. Okay, but that's not what we're doing today. What we're doing today is looking at something called inferences. We make inferences in everyday life. Nearly everything in our life requires us to engage with context of the situation and think about what's happening. So I've given you this little starting picture. And I want you to write in the chat because I'm hoping this year we can make it a bit more interactive. So I've put on a little picture. What is happening in this picture? It should hopefully be pretty simple, but what is happening here? Exactly that. Someone said they're watching a movie, eating popcorn, and having a good time. But the reason I put this on is because this is a good example of making what we call an inference. You knew by looking at the context of what is happening in this photo what the situation is. You knew by looking at clues in the photo, you could work out what was going on. So the clues are hopefully you should have noticed a big popcorn. You should have noticed them laughing, looking at what appears to be reflective light off a screen, and you should have worked out there at the cinema. What about now? What do you think's happened here, and how do you know? Put in the chat if you think you have any idea. This one should hopefully be a little bit more difficult because there are options of things you could say. For example, someone says it looks like a window was broken and the wind spilled the papers. I hadn't considered that, but that is a good answer. Yeah, there's a few things you can have for this. It depends how creative you're feeling. It could be the window was broken. Maybe somebody's broken in and that's it looks like it's abandoned. It could be. Perhaps it's an abandoned house. Someone's broken in, made all this mess because they've attempted to rob the place. Maybe it's just someone who lives a very disordered and chaotic life, like an artist. The reason I've shown you this one compared to this one here is because inferences can only get you part of the way. Looking at pictures like this is easier, but there is often missing information, so we don't get the full story. But when it comes to writing and literature, there are other things that you could look at to hopefully give you a better understanding of what is happening in the story. So we make inferences every day, and I'll give you a few examples of what I mean by an inference before we look at what they actually are. But as humans, we are always curious about what is going on around us in the world. And we're always trying to work out everything that is going on. In order to do this, we have to use clues within our surroundings in order to make a sort of educated guess about what might be happening. So, for example, you might walk past a house with balloons outside playing music. Well, I think the obvious assumption would be that there's a party going on, perhaps birthday or general celebration. That would be an inference. You've taken the clues that you've seen, the balloons and the music, to work out that there's a party. Similarly, if you looked at somebody and they were frowning, you would assume or work out that they were feeling sad. I've made a mistake here. I've put if your dad starts barking at the door, I meant your dog. If your dog starts barking at the door, apologies for my typo, and whimpering, that should hopefully help you to work out that they maybe want to go outside. And the reason I'm going through this is because these are good examples of inferences. And all an inference is coming up with a conclusion or an idea that the reader works out from clues in the text, rather than being directly told it. So we use evidence from the text, whether that's the choice of words, whether that's how the words are used, and we use our own knowledge and our reasoning to work out what is happening. Another way of saying this might be, you might have heard before, to read between the lines. That's a saying that means we can work things out by looking at the context of the situation. And two ways in which we can make inferences are by using subtext and connotations, and we'll come on to those in a sec. But all of English is about forming your own opinions based on the writer's choices, structure, and the general story, and working out your own inferences. Let me just have a quick look at the chat. I did misspell dog as dad, and that was silly of me. You can tell that I wrote these real quick. So let's look at some inference examples, and we can work out what is going on here. So first one, Mrs. Lee sat at her desk waiting for the children to finish their work. Could we work out from this what Mrs. Lee does as a job, do you think? In the chat, is there any keywords, anything that tells you in there what she might do for her job? I would agree. I think she's a teacher, and I think what tells us that is the fact that she's A, sat at a desk, she's B, waiting for specifically children to finish their work, which tells you can infer from those clues that she is a teacher. The second one then. Emma glanced at the clock for the third time in 5 minutes. She tapped her foot under the table and chewed the end of her pen. Can we work out how Emma is feeling? Any ideas? I'd look at the clues that are there. Think about the clock that she's looking at. Why, in what situation might be she looking at a clock? Why might she have looked at it so often? When do people tend to tap their feet, specifically under tables and chewing at pens? Bored is an answer. Anything else? Anxious or nervous? Yeah, this is the answer I was looking for. I think she's specifically in a test. Whether she's nervous or whether she's anxious, I think she's in an exam at this minute in time. And I know that because she's sat at a table and she's looking at the clock, tells me that she's in an exam. Now, how she's feeling, this is up for interpretation. I personally would argue anxious or nervous, just because when I look at a clock that many times, it tends to be less out of boredom. Obviously, that's a personal thing, but I think it would be anxiety, but it is up for debate. Number 3, then, the dog's lead hung by the door. Muddy boots lay by the mat, and a half-empty bowl of water sat on the kitchen floor. What can we infer just happened in the house, do you think? Thinking specifically about the setting. There's a dog lead. There's muddy boots. There's a half bowl empty of water. Potentially someone broke in. I don't think that's the obvious answer, but it's certainly an interpretation. I think focus on the dog's lead. I would hope that would give you the answer here. I think it's that. I think that the dog went on a walk with the owner, and I think they just got back. And the owner's come in, hung up the dog lead, taken off his boots, and set some water down on the floor for the dog, who's clearly been very thirsty and drunk half of it. And I could infer that from the clues of the situation. Finally, then, Daniel walked quickly past the shop, pulling his hood over his head. He kept his eyes on the ground and didn't look at the window display. Why might Daniel be avoiding the shop? Now, this is up for interpretation. I think there's multiple creative answers you could have here. And I want to see what people come up with. Think about how he's acted. So, he walked quickly past the shop. He had a hood over his head and he kept looking down, specifically not looking at the window display. I think yes. One option is that he could be scared of someone inside. He's nervous. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, he could be embarrassed from people he's seen at school. Absolutely, all of these are good answers. And there is no correct answer, but you've taken the clues and you start to have to think about it. Personally, what I came up with is, I think was a more bleak answer. I think he could have possibly stolen from something from the shop before. The reason I thought that was because I focused a lot on the window display. I thought, why would someone specifically not look at the window display? Because it doesn't say that he's not looking in the shop. It says that he's not looking at the window display. And so that made me personally think that it might be that he's stolen something before. But it is possibly that he's seen someone inside that he's scared of or that he's embarrassed of and that he doesn't want to see. And clues that tell us that are the fact that he's hiding his face with the hood. He's quickly walking past so that he's not seen. And he's kept his eyes on the ground, possibly out of embarrassment or shame. Yeah, something bad, I would assume, has happened here. Excellent. So I hope you're starting to see how taking clues, specifically looking at the choices that have been made, could tell us about what's happened in the story without actually directly telling us what's happened in the story. So I've highlighted what I would pick out here, but I think we've been through it. Okay, so we've talked about inferences, about using clues to give us the story. But what about subtext? This is slightly different, and I kind of touched on this at the very end of last year. But subtext is where you find the hidden meaning underneath the words. So it's something that you can find out from a text that's not directly told to you by the author. So you have to work it out from the choices that are made. And it's very important in writing because it's what allows for multiple interpretations. It's what allows us to understand character, motives, story. It's what makes story interesting. And why does it matter so much? Well, it allows us to understand what characters really think and feel, which is important for our experience as a reader. Because why would you want to read a story that you don't A, understand, and B, connect with? It would make things very boring for you. So subtext is a good mental exercise to help you understand the characters. It also helps you understand their motives, perhaps create tension and suspense, and maybe understand relationships between characters. Think about in your own life. If you ever have a bad relationship with somebody, um, people often know, not because you've told them, but because of how you act around each other. They've picked up on the subtext of your relationship with maybe your friend that you've fallen out with. Maybe you were really close to this person, and now you sort of stare each other down and you look at each other in a negative way. That could be picked up as subtext. Someone's worked out that you're not friends anymore without actually being told. And yeah, it makes the story more interesting, gives you sort of richer, deeper context. Now, there's certain ways that we can spot subtext, and one of them is to look at what is said versus how it is said. So subtext isn't necessarily the choice of words or the specific words, but it's how those words are used. So tone, pauses, body language, speech. Then you can sort of look at what is left out. What the character doesn't say is just as important as what they say. And you might have heard that in real life. Body language, tone of voice, all of that tells you, facial expression can tell you just as much about a person as what they're saying. There's a scientific study that says 7% of communication is speech. That means the rest, the 93%, is left to play with. And the 93% is everything that isn't speech. So if that's the case, we would only know 7% theoretically of what people are thinking. It's because of what they told us. So this is why subtext is so important for understanding a story, because 93% of the understanding is not within the words on the page. And I think that's so fun as a concept of as a reader and even as a writer. And thinking about the context then. So the settings, the relationships, the situation could tell you a lot about the subtext. So a good classic example of subtext is imagine if your friend had come to you and there's different ways you could say I'm fine. Imagine if you said to your friend, how are you? And they go, yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. That's very different to if they went, I'm fine. You know, the subtext there is different. What they're saying, that 7% of communication is exactly the same, but the 93%, very different. There's a different tone in the way that I've said it. There's a different facial expression in my face, different body language. And that conveys so much more than just the words I'm fine. It clearly tells you that I'm not fine. Or the first option might tell you, yeah, I'm really good. So the subtext is they might be upset, angry, or scared, but they're hiding it. Now, I want to link back to this image that I gave you 10 minutes ago because subtext is complex. It's not an easy, straightforward thing to understand. You know, it's not necessarily understood just by looking at the choices of words, but rather the circumstances and the context in which they are used. And it can tell the reader a lot about the characters. See, subtext is the thing that helps to understand exactly what has happened. Think back to this messy room example. You all gave me different possible outcomes of the situation. Not one of them was necessarily the correct answer because there are options. You use the clues to make inferences, but your inferences only went so far. You have to use other clues to help you understand more accurately, and that's what subtext does. So looking at subtext examples then, there's 5 different things that I came up with that I think are good ways of telling subtext. The first one is short dialogue. So the example that we looked at is, I'm fine. Obviously, if someone was described as avoiding eye contact and fidgeting, as they said, I'm fine, that would be the subtext. That would give you more clues than just the I'm fine as to what's going on. You can infer accurately how they're feeling. So obviously, if someone avoids eye contact, I think it infers that they're either nervous, they're anxious, they're bored, something negative. And I think if they're fidgeting, that's often what people do when they're scared. So I think that tells you the subtext is that they say that they're fine, but they're not really fine. So yeah, body language and situation can give us true feelings. So it's important to look out for that if you're reading a short story or a novel or whatever. Always don't just look directly at the dialogue, but look at the descriptions of the characters as well. A descriptive context example. So if the text said, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the envelope, her hands trembling slightly, we can work out from that through inferences and through subtext what was maybe in the letter. The fact that she folded it carefully, because that's a choice. She placed it back in the envelope. Why? And her hands were trembling. And I think those three clues tell us maybe what was in the letter, how she was feeling when she opened the letter. So the letter, I would say, probably contains something shocking or emotional. Otherwise, she wouldn't have put it back. If it didn't mean something to her, she would have just tossed it aside. Equally, she wouldn't have folded it specifically carefully if it didn't mean something to her, if it wasn't something emotional. And also the fact that she was trembling. She's clearly feeling a lot of nerves. So a good example of context, again, helping us work out what is going on. She could be entering into a school or college she wants to go to. That's a very valid interpretation. She could. It could be a rejection letter from a college or a school. It could be a letter from a long lost family member who wants to get in touch with her, but she doesn't want to get in touch with them. It could be a lover who she doesn't love back, or maybe who doesn't love her back. It could be anything. But I think using the context that we have, we've worked out most of the story. And I hope you would agree that makes it more interesting. Setting-based subtext. The room was silent except for the clock ticking. John sat in the corner staring at the floor while his sister packed her bags. Now, we can again work out from the clues what is potentially happening. The fact that the room was silent, even though there were multiple people in there, tells us that they're not speaking to each other. The clock ticking is quite a common motif used in literature. Often clock ticking symbolizes this awkwardness, this unsaid. And so the fact that they've used that sort of motif presents an atmosphere of something unsettling. So along with the fact that they're not talking, and then John sat in the corner specifically, why would somebody sit in the corner? We've got to think. The clues there would potentially tell us that he's either pulling himself away from the other person, or he's feeling very introspective or anxious. But again, it's something clearly very negative. He's then staring at the floor, very similar to our boy example on the last slide, clearly trying to avoid something. And then his sister packed her bags, suggesting that maybe she's leaving and he's very conflicted about it. Perhaps they've had a fight, or perhaps it's just a really sad leaving situation. But either way, the clues tell us or give us ideas of what the emotions are for the scene, which we can then use our personal experiences to work out what the story might be. A lot of English people don't realize is problem solving. And I think that's what's so important about English is a lot of people dismiss it as a subject because they think, oh, so I'm never going to need it, it's so easy. But what you don't realize is it is a lot of problem solving. Like you can work out what is going on in a situation by using the clues. You're a detective in a situation. The role of the reader is always a detective, and that's what makes it interesting. A contradiction subtext example. If the text was, of course I trust you, she said, smiling tightly as she watched him leave. Now, the dialogue contrasts heavily to the way that she's acted. So that contradiction also could tell us something deeper about her character. If I had just left it at the dialogue and it was, of course, I trust you, we've got to take it then on face value. We've got to say, okay, we've got to assume what she was saying was true. But because we've got that extra little bit of description, the fact that she was smiling tightly as she watched him leave, that extra bit of context helps us to infer that what actually she doesn't mean what she's saying, and which completely changes her character. So maybe she doesn't actually trust him, that her words contradict her body language and her tone. So that could be another example of subtext and reading between the lines. And then potentially an action-based subtext. So, for example, he slammed the door on his way out and kicked the chair over. We've got to look at the situation there. We can infer that he's angry, frustrated, or rebellious without him actually saying that he's angry. And we know that because in our lives, think back to a time where maybe you slammed the door. You've done it out of frustration, I would hope. Kicking the chair over. Sometimes when humans get very angry, sometimes we get a lot of pent-up anger, and it often comes out as displaced physical violence. So that, again, we can infer using subtext the situation, how he's feeling. Now, this differs slightly to, you might have heard your teachers say the word connotation. If not, you will. A connotation is slightly different to subtext, where subtext is not the specific word choices, but how they're used. And connotation refers specifically to those choice of words. So it's the emotional or cultural meaning that we as a reader give to a word beyond its definition. So I'm trying to think of an example here. A good example from A Christmas Carol is it describes the ghost of Marley as a lobster. Now that's an interesting choice of word. And there's a reason that that choice of word has been made. And that's the connotation. Because the connotation is the meaning that we give to it as the reader. What do we associate with that word that therefore tells us something about the character without actually telling us something about the character? And for example, when I think of the word lobster, I think of it has claws, therefore it's quite dangerous, therefore it's quite scary. And so I then have learnt or can work out or can infer that the ghost is something to be feared or something that is scary. Whereas the writer, Charles Dickens, never actually tells me the ghost is scary, but I can work it out just by the choice of the word lobster, which I've placed connotations on. So why does this matter in English? Well, it sets the tone of a story, whether it's tense, whether it's joyful, mysterious, threatening, and therefore reveals emotions without telling the reader directly, and therefore shapes the response of the reader to the characters, to the settings, to the events, and tells us something about the character. It makes the story so much more interesting when we're not directly told. Imagine if you were reading a story and everything was spelt out for you, how boring that story would be. We need description. As humans, we're inherently drawn towards wanting to work things out. And so connotations are a massive part of that. And the choice of words affects the whole sentence, the whole story, as different words carry different associations from the reader. I'm actually going to skip and come back to this. And carry on with connotation. Just to show you what I mean by connotation. So take a neutral word, for example, the word looked. If I said, I looked at the door over there, is there any way I could change that word to change the meaning of the sentence? So if I wanted to make it into something negative, I could maybe change the word into glare or stare or squint. All of those words have something negative that I associate with those words, and therefore I can infer and work out that the door is now a really negative thing. If I glare at the door, let's change the door. Let's say I glare at a person rather than look at them. I can work out from that choice of words how I feel about that person. Because I think glaring is something that you do when you're maybe angry at somebody, when you're frustrated, or you're confused. It's something negative. Similar with if you're squinting at somebody, you might do that out of anger or frustration because you're seething in your face. Whereas if I wanted to give it a positive connotation, I might say I admired that person. That's very different to glaring. If I admired it, it kind of confers love or something, infatuation. If I glance at them, that's much more light, much more airy as a word. Same if I took a neutral word, such as said. I'm saying this to you now. But what if I snapped at you? That's a very different story. It tells us something new about what's going on, about the characters, about the story, about the relationships. Um, Snapping is something you do when you're angry. And so it confers anger. It conveys anger, rather. If you mutter something, that's something that you tend to do when you're maybe nervous or you don't want to speak to somebody. And so that allows us to infer something further. Similar with hissed, that's something you do when you're angry as well. Whereas if I wanted to give it a positive connotation, I might use beamed. That has much more happy, joyful energy to it, which tells me or confers something positive about the relationship between me and that person that I'm gleaming at, or beamed at, sorry. Another one, walked, that's a very neutral word, could mean anything. But what if I stumbled? If I was walking along a road and I stumbled? I mean, falling over is never a fun thing. It's quite embarrassing. It's quite, and often people get angry when they fall over because they've just got all of this pent up embarrassment that they just want to displace it. If I'm creeping on somebody, that suggests something dark and sinister. Very different if I walked into the room compared to if I crept into the room. If I stormed into the room, another story completely. That's something angry, it's an outburst. And I'm hoping beginning to see how connotation helps us with our inferences. It helps us to work out what's going on in the story, in the characters' minds, beyond what is told to us on the page. House is a very neutral word. What if I described it as a shack? That's often got scary and eerie vibes. Very different to if I said it was a home. If it was a dump, that tells me it's probably dirty, it's run down, it's decrepit, it's falling apart, compared to a haven, which is something heavenly and homely and wonderful. And a sanctuary as well has much more positive vibes, kind of gives the idea of healing and a place of refuge. So I hope you can begin to see how connotation plays a huge part. But I want to quickly mention, I'll go over some messy room examples. So thinking back to that picture of the messy room and how if we take away the picture and we now put it into words, how you can get a much more accurate inference from these words using subtext and connotations. So firstly, the drawers were pulled out and emptied onto the floor. Papers fluttered across the room and the window latch was broken, swinging slightly in the colder breeze. His wallet keys were gone and the safe lay open on the carpet. Now, I've highlighted some bits that I personally would pick out. But that tells me through the choice of the words, the connotations and the subtext, what's actually going on. It's no longer just a messy room. I know exactly what's happened. They've pulled out and emptied the drawers. That already tells me there's chaos of some sort. The window latch was broken. I can infer from that somebody has probably broken in. I don't know, but I can infer that it's either been broken by accident by the homeowner or somebody's broken it from the outside. But the fact that the wallet and keys were gone suggests that actually it's a break-in. And same with the safe that it lays open. And so all of that subtext can give me a much more accurate view of the story. If you're thinking specifically about connotations, I'd maybe look at the word fluttered. I think fluttered has a more airy and light connotation than other choices of words, but it still conveys, personally, I would say, chaos. Whereas compared to example two, let's say sketchbooks lay open on the floor and tubes of paint and charcoal were scattered around. The desk was covered with half-finished drawings and coffee-stained notes. A palette with bright smears of colour sat on a chair and ideas were pinned to the walls above the desks. Now, that's a very different story to the one on the left. The fact that we've got specifically sketchbooks They've mentioned paint. Um, they've talked about half-finished drawings. I mean, I already know there's probably not a break-in, that this is probably an artist's house because I have connotations of those words relating to artists. Same with the palette. If we're looking at the coffee-stained notes, think about the connotations that we associate with coffee. It's a drink that people have to keep them awake, to stimulate them. What kind of people might want to be stimulated? Artists. They often keep themselves up in search of ideas and inspiration. Um, Comparing the verb of scattered to fluttered. Both of them give a sort of chaotic vibe, but I think fluttered gives a more disorganized chaos, whereas scattered is a more organized and passionate chaos. And so the specific choice or connotations of those words convey a completely different story. So you see what I mean? A lot of English is working things out. It's problem solving. Okay, two more examples, and then we'll do some inference questions examples. So, clothes were strewn across the bed, and empty snack wrappers littered the floor. Posters hung crookedly on the walls, and the desk was stacked with books and papers haphazardly. Now, I already know this is probably a teenager's bedroom, and I know that because we've got specific mention of clothes across the bed, uh, empty snack wrappers. This clearly isn't a break-in or an artist's house. I mean, there's snack wrappers. Someone's eaten them. There's posters hung crookedly on the wall, stacks of books, all of these things that I relate to academia or some sort of person studying. Again, the connotation of the word strewn, I think, gives an idea of chaos again, but also of carelessness. Like if you strewn something across the room, it's because you don't really care about it. And I would associate that with, again, teenage behavior. So it tells us the inference, what we can work out from the choice of words, is that this person who owns this room is potentially lazy, maybe busy, or doesn't care about tidiness. And we can look specifically at the connotations of strewn and littered to give that impression. Also, this stacked with books. It doesn't say a pile of books, it says that the books were stacked, and that's a specific choice of words. And I personally think that gives the connotation of someone who's quite driven. I think if you've got a stack of books, it suggests quite a lot of books. And I think to myself, who would have a lot of books? Well, I think it's someone in academia. I think it's someone studying. So that adds and supports my idea that this is a teenager's bedroom. And then finally, cups, plates, and streamers were scattered across the floor. A few half-eaten snacks rested on the sofa, and balloons sagged in the corners. Shoes and jackets were left by the door. Now, again, I can look at the specific context of the situation: cups, plates, streamers, all of which I associate with a party. Similarly, the half-eaten snacks, the balloons. So I already know there's probably been a party happened there. So the mess I can infer was caused by other visiting people, not the occupant directly. And so I can infer that there was a recent party or gathering, not a crime, not a lazy teenager, and not a chaotic artist. So I hope you can begin to see. I know this is somewhat simple, but I think it's useful nonetheless to go through inferences. So I've been to this slide before last year. Some of you might not have been here, but I think these are some interesting choices of words that I want to highlight in literature. I showed you these in the context of creative writing, but I think it's worth coming back to them because it highlights to you how important connotations are. So these are some really interesting ones in novels. Edgar Allan Poe is a very famous sort of Gothic horror writer, if you don't know who Edgar Allan Poe is. And he wrote a novel called The Raven. And in his quote, he chose to specifically say, quaff the raven, nevermore. Specifically made the choice to use the word quaff. And the effect that it has is it creates this Gothic and eerie tone, rather than saying that the raven, sorry, that he said the raven He specifically changed it to something that had maybe a more negative connotation, therefore making the reader feel unnerved and unsettled. Um, The Great Gatsby, hopefully a novel that you should know, written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. A famous quote from that book is, "So we beat on, boats against the current." The specific choice of the verb to beat suggests something struggling, futility. It suggests that it's a perfect metaphor for human desire. I think it's a very interesting choice of words. He could have just said the boats went on. The boats went on the lake. But he didn't. He said the boats beat on. And I think as a reader, you should be able to associate certain emotions and experiences with that word beat that should give you a more clear picture or inference of the characters in the story who are clearly struggling. Right, because we've not got long left, apologies, I started later today. We ran over on the previous classes. I want you to think about these questions before we move on to this next task. We're going to do some inference questions together. We're going to read a story, and I want you to think about these questions. So take a picture of these because I'm going to get you to come up with some answers for me in the chat. So yes, we've got some new people this year. Interesting. Welcome to anyone who is new. If you don't know me, so I probably should have introduced myself at the beginning. I'm Mr. Clock. I do these English sessions. They're going to be getting a bit harder. They're going to be going into more specific things. But you're welcome to come to any of them that you want. So, right, reading the story then. Sam squinted against the sun at the distant dust trail tracked in by the car on its way up to the big house. The horses kicked and flicked their tails at flies, not caring about their owner's first visit in 10 months. Sam waited. Mr. Carter didn't come out here unless he had to, which was just fine by Sam. The more he kept out of his boss's way, the longer he'd have a job. Carter came by while Sam was chopping wood. Carter lifted his hat as if he were waiting for an appointment with the town priest, and then removed it completely as if he were talking to his mother. He pulled out a pile of paper from his back pocket and held it out. "Don't pick up your mail often, do you?" Sam took it without a glance and dropped the envelopes onto the bench. "Never," he replied, and waited for Carter to say why he was here. The fact it was Carter's house was no explanation, and they both knew it. Carter twisted his hat round and round, licking his lips and clearing his throat. "Nice work fixing those fences," he said finally. "I'll be back to the beginning soon," Sam said. It wasn't a complaint. A fence that took a year to repair meant another year's work to the man who did it well. "Don't you ever take a holiday?" "And go where?" A holiday meant being back out in the real world, a place even people like Carter traveled to escape from. Sam's escape was his reality, and he wasn't going back. Mr. Carter wiped the sweat from the back of his neck. The damp patches on his shirt drew together like shapes and knots. His skin was already turning ruddy in the June sun. Otherwise, he had the indoor tan of a man that made money whilst other people did the work. "I've brought my son with me on this trip. He's had some trouble at school." Mr. Carter's eyes flicked up, blinked rapidly, and then shifted back to the hat occupying his hands. "Not much trouble out here for a young boy." He attempted a laugh, but it came out like a dog's bark. The two men looked towards the northern end of the property. It stretched as far as the eye could see. Even the fences were barely visible from where they stood. However bored and rebellious a teenage boy might get, it wasn't possible to escape on foot. Sam looked at the biggest of the horses, kicked at the ground with its heavy hooves. Could the boy ride, he wondered? There was a whole load of trouble a good rider could get into out here, miles away from anyone. But maybe there was even more trouble for someone who knew nothing about horses and wanted to get away from his father. Okay, so thinking specifically about the questions I just gave you. Let's start to work these out together. So take a picture of these and we'll go through these. So firstly, what can we infer about Sam's attitude towards Mr. Carter? We should be able to look for clues in this text that tell us. Personally, I'll leave it up to you. Have any of you come up with anything? I would personally look at the way he responds to Carter's entrance. So yeah, he didn't like Mr. Carter that much. I would agree with that. What tells us that in this text? He knew Mr. Carter didn't approve. He couldn't take a holiday because he wouldn't know where to go. So yeah, he didn't like Mr. Carter very much. I think, is there anything specific that tells you that? I would maybe look at this quote up here. The more he kept out of his boss's way, the longer he'd have a job. Now, I think that conveys the subtext here that Mr. Carter's probably not a very nice person. The fact that he doesn't want to be around his boss should tell you that maybe he's scared of him, maybe he just doesn't like him. Uh, yeah, something negative in terms of their relationship, I think. So yeah, along the lines of he didn't like Mr. Carter very much. And I think there's multiple things in here that would tell you that. Okay, question 2 then. How does Sam feel about his work on the fences? What clues show you this? Well, this person has said he knew Mr. Carter didn't approve very much. I would agree with that. I think there is evidence that Mr. Carter doesn't approve. However, I would more look at a section down here. A fence that took a year to repair meant another man's work to the man who did it well. To me, that conveys a sense of almost pride. The fact that I think Sam takes pride in his work. It shows that he values doing a good job. He doesn't just want to do the job for the sake of it, he wants to do it well, otherwise he doesn't really find purpose in that. And so I would maybe use that quote to tell you, to infer that he clearly takes pride in his work. Someone asked, does reading help with learning vocabulary? Because I'm reading The Black Phone and someone says that it helps with vocabulary because the harder the book, the better the vocabulary, and he wants to improve the vocabulary. I would say, yeah, reading, and I encourage reading a lot. The more you read, the more you will pick up new words. I think the best thing to do is when you come across a new word in a book, note it down. Purposely go out of your way, learn the definition of that word, and keep a little journal or a little notebook of new words. Because when it comes to GCSEs, you get marked in creative writing on the number of, I want to say ambitious, your ambitious selection of vocabulary. So it definitely will help to read because you'll get you into a sort of routine of picking up new words and beginning to understand new words. So definitely keep reading. Okay, next question then. What does Sam's comment about holidays reveal about his priorities or his mindset? Well, let's see what people have put. He couldn't take a holiday because he wouldn't know where to go. I don't think it's necessarily about not knowing where to go. I think there is a quote in here that is good. I mean, yes, he does literally say and go where, but I think we need to look at the subtext here. We need to look beyond exactly what is said. We can't take dialogue on face value. Look at here, a place people even like Carter traveled to escape from. Sam's escape was his reality, and he wasn't going back. I think that quote tells us all we need to know. I think it tells us that Sam much prefers routine. He much prefers being on the farm and working over having a traditional holiday. The fact that his escaping reality is his work tells us that he actually quite enjoys work. If he finds it an escape, then clearly he must enjoy it. He clearly finds freedom in working rather than traveling. So I think, yes, I think on a literal level, well done for picking out the quote and go where. But I think he doesn't necessarily mean it in a, oh, I wouldn't know where to go way. I think he means it in a, well, and go where. I like being on the farm. I find purpose being here in my work. And I think that's what the subtext is of that dialogue. And the reason I worked that out is because I looked at the rest of the sentence. Like I said before, don't take dialogue on face value. Read the rest of the clues that are in that sentence. Okay. So why does Sam prefer Carter to keep out of his way? Someone said to keep working, potentially. I think it's on the right lines. I think similar to the previous question, I think Sam's a practical person. He enjoys work. He's self-sufficient. He does best on his own. So the fact that he has less interference from Carter, I think he will do a better job. I think there's more job security through this first quote. The more he kept out of his boss's way, the longer he'd have a job. I think he likes working by himself because he knows there's job security in it. Okay. Right, I'm going to give you some more questions. I know we've only got a few minutes, but I'm going to start. Yeah, let's do Mr. Carter real quick. So let's just focus on these three here, and then I will give you some homework reading to do. And I'll talk about that in a second. So, first question, what can we infer about Carter's personality from the way he behaves when he arrives? How does Carter feel about bringing his son to the property? And how do we know? And what does the description of Carter's indoor tan suggest about the way he lives compared to Sam? Okay, firstly, what can we infer about Carter's personality from the way that he behaves when he arrives? Well, first, let's look at what he does when he arrives. Carter twisted his hat round and round, licking his lips and clearing his throat. Why might a person do that? There's certain personality clues there in the answer. Any ideas? When a person clears their throat, it tends to be maybe out of nerves. Yeah, it tends to be maybe out of nerves that someone clears their throat. Maybe they're unsure. When someone licks their lips, it says that they've got dry lips. Why might a person have dry lips? Why might he take off his hat and fidget? I think it's all suggesting nerves or some sort of uncomfortable feeling. Right. How does Carter feel about bringing his son to the property? Now, let's look at the quote down here. He attempted a laugh, but it came out like a dog's bark. Again, I think there's this awkward feeling to it. The fact that he kind of tries to laugh, but it kind of comes out as this like stuck in his throat sort of sound. And I think that tells us from the subtext that it's kind of an anxious response rather than taking literally. Yeah, maybe he couldn't talk. And again, why? When might a person not be able to talk? When you've heard of that phrase before that says, I've got a frog stuck in my throat. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's that feeling of anxiety and nerves. You can't get it out. Maybe he doesn't want him there. Yeah. And then finally, what do you think the indoor tan means? Yes, on a literal sense, it might suggest that he's pale, but can we take it further? Can we look at the subtext to infer something about Carter's personality? Any ideas? He doesn't like to socialize. I think, yeah, I think that's part of the answer. Clearly, he's very unsociable. He doesn't like to go outside. Maybe we could think about it in terms of him as a boss, as him as sort of this capitalist boss. I think it also potentially tells us something about the way that he earns money. Clearly, he doesn't work outside on the farm, otherwise he'd be getting a tan. So what does he do? He must own the farm. And he clearly works without having to put in physical labor. And I think, therefore, that must tell us that it highlights his wealth and his clear social status compared to Sam. Okay, right. I'll give you some homework. This year, last year I was slack on homework, and because these sessions are kind of extra compared to the normal sessions, but I've been told off not giving you homework. So this year, unfortunately, um, homework is technically still optional, but it's frowned upon if you don't do it. So please send me homework. Yeah, I'm going to give you some more things to do, and I encourage you to do the homework because um, a lot of the Key Stage 3 work is going to be reading and inference questions and learning new vocabulary because I think it's so important that you learn new words. It's so important that you practice these skills of inference. So, what I'm going to give you is task one. I'm going to give you a text, and it's an extract from the novel by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. Hopefully, you've known the story or seen the film. And within this extract, there are 10 new words. And I want you to try and work out and define what these new words are before the next session. So take a photo of this. Equally, this is recorded. So if you don't get to take a photo, rewatch it later. But this is task one. And we're going to add these to our new word list, which we're going to extend quite a lot this year. And then task two, I've given you some inference questions. And I don't have to do all of these. You can do as many as you want, as many as you don't want, but I would like to get some answers back. There are certain people that consistently sent me homework last year, and I really appreciated that, and others who did not. So, yeah, I encourage you to do it. So here is the extract. Apologies, I couldn't put it as a PDF because I can't send things out to you. So I've screenshotted it as part of the PowerPoint. So take a picture of this, screenshot it, whatever you need to do. But this is the extract to go with those questions. Okay, let's look at the chat before we move on. So the way that you tend to send it in is, sorry, I should have specified for people that are new. Your parents will have Mr. Siddiqui's work email. If you send it to him, it will get to me. I don't have a work email, unfortunately. So anything that you do, you can write in a Microsoft Word or Google Doc and send it to him, and it will get sent to me. I will give you feedback and get it sent back. I will speak actually to Mr. Siddiqui, see if there's an easier way we can get an easier way to upload homework, because he was the one that told me he wanted me to make you do homework. So I will get him to do an easier way. But other than that, that's Key Stage 3 done for today. If it's as per last year, if there's anything you want me to do specifically, I'm open to suggestions. But it's mostly going to be easier stuff. So inferences. I'll do some language and creative writing again, as I did last year. So yes. So you sent me a piece of homework before summer. Has it been marked? It will have been. I marked everything that was sent to me. So if it's not been sent back to you, I would get back to Mrs. Siddiqui. Can I please mark Macbeth you sent yesterday? I've not got your Macbeth, so I will chase that up with Mrs. Siddiqui because I've not been sent that. But yes, I will mark your Macbeth for you. Any recommendations for reading? Honestly, what would I suggest? Not specific texts. I think just reading in general is really important because it gets you into a routine of problem solving and learning new words and looking at how sentences are written and subtext and all of that. So I just say read what you enjoy to read. I don't think there's a specific genre that is better than others for learning. Maybe sort of crime is quite a good thing to learn from because obviously it's detective fiction. So anything sort of suspenseful and mystery is maybe better. Can I do Inspector Calls? Yes. If you stay for this next session, I have got a basic plan of what I'm going to do for the first few weeks of this year. Can we send the work again? Yes, you can. Are we going to do Macbeth? Yes, we are right now. So, right, let's move on. Now, unfortunately, this first session, what I was originally going to do, and those of you who were here with me last year know that I really, really wanted to get through Macbeth, and I didn't because the last few sessions of the year were cut off for various reasons that were out of my control. But I really wanted to get Macbeth done, and I didn't get it done. But I'm fully aware that we have new students in this year. So I didn't want to jump straight back in to what we were doing because I didn't want it to not make sense for the new people who were here. So I thought what best to do is do a little recap of what we talked about because we did 3 acts worth of Macbeth. We looked at all the context and we did some language analysis. And so I wanted to do a bit of a recap. So I'm sorry if you don't find this the most useful today, but I need to cater for the new students. And then from next week, we will continue from where we left off. So, as a recap of Macbeth, then, let's first start with exam structure. In the exam of AQA, if you're doing AQA, you get a question that looks like this. You'll get an extract and you'll be asked a question about either a character or a theme of the play. So you'll be given an extract and you'll be told exactly where in the play it is from. So this is from the 20, this is one of the last few years worth of papers. And they got given an extract from Act 1, Scene 5. And that's important information because you get marked on your structural analysis as well as language. So it's really important that you know where this scene is from because it tells you what's happening in the plot in relation to the rest of the play, what's happening to the themes, the characters. So it's really important that you have this information. It also gives you a little summary about what's happening in the scene. And again, that's important for understanding characters, which will be important for your answer. You'll then be given an extract to analyze. And I've highlighted here both language and structure. We went over language and structure way too much last year. And if you don't know it, go back through my other sessions because it's really important. But I will do more language and structure, I promise. You would then get given a question, and it will always say, starting with this speech. I really want to highlight this because you'd be so shocked how many people do not actually write about the extract that is given to them. I have marked too many answers where people have not used this extract. It specifically tells you in the question, start with this speech. Now, that doesn't mean you have to stay at the speech. It could just be one paragraph about this speech, but you have to do it because that's what the question is asked for. It then at the bottom says, write about how Shakespeare presents X, Y, and Z in this speech, then how Shakespeare presents X, Y, and Z in the play as a whole. And that's important because when it says the play as a whole, what it's really asking you is how does this moment link to the rest of the play? Why is it important in the context of the rest of the play? That's really what it's asking you. Does that make sense? Will year 10 and 11s be given Macbeth a GCSE as well? Yes, you will. Schools have a choice about what Shakespeare text to give you. I personally not come across anybody that's not doing Macbeth, but it is possible your school might not be. But this is the main one that people do. Is there going to be like a reading test? And is this still the 7 to 8? So 7 to 8 is specifically Key Stage 3. Okay, so when it comes to answering your question, we've talked a lot in the past about Peter paragraphs, which I would link to English language. But when you're thinking about English literature, I would personally use PTEC. So what I mean by this is an acronym for point, evidence, terminology, explain, and context. And within your answer, you should be aiming for 3 to 4 PTEC paragraphs. And I've given you an example of what I mean, and I've highlighted it in colours. So Shakespeare presents ambition as a corrupting force that drives individuals towards destruction. I've highlighted it in green because the student has made a point. Straight from the first sentence, they've told you what their point is. In Act 1, Scene 7, Macbeth reflects that he has no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition which overleaps himself. Marked in blue because that is the quotation evidence. The metaphor of vaulting ambition compares his desire for power to a rider leaping too far and falling, suggesting that unchecked ambition is reckless and self-sabotaging. The person has given a nice bit of explanation to explain the meaning of the quote beyond the literal interpretation. And I've highlighted metaphor and foreshadowing as the terminology here. This moment reveals Macbeth's awareness that his only motivation is to kill Duncan in his ambition, not loyalty or justice, foreshadowing the tragic downfall that follows. Shakespeare, writing in the Jacobean era, warns his audience of the dangers of ambition destabilizing the natural order, a theme that would resonate strongly in a society that valued obedience to the king under the divine right of kings. So a lovely little bit of context in there, and we'll go over context again in a second. Therefore, ambition is shown not as a noble quality, but as a dangerous flaw that leads to chaos and moral corruption. So we'll look more at point evidence terminology, explain context in the future and in this session, but this is a good example of that structure. Is this something that people have come across before? I know this is something that people have mentioned to me to do in the past. Okay, this question is out of 34 marks. 30 marks are for the actual content. 4 marks are for your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And these are called the way that we break down the marks by what we call assessment objectives. So you might have seen AOs before and might not know what they are. They're basically just things that we expect of you in the answer. And we break down the marking on these expectations. So AO1 and AO2 are both 35%. They're about 12 marks out of 30. AO3 is 6 marks and AO4 is 4 marks. And that's how we break it down. So when you're writing your answer, it's useful to have these in your mind because then you know what is expected of you in your answer. So I'm going to start by breaking these down. Linking to point evidence terminology, explain, and context. So AO1 is specifically point and evidence. What AQA have said in their mark scheme is reading and understanding and responding to texts. Students should be able to maintain a critical style and develop an informed, personal response. Use textual references, including quotations, to support and illustrate interpretations. So in other words, AO1 is your point and your quotes. Picking a large amount of quotes that are relevant to the question and making a good point that is relevant to the question will get you those 12 AO1 marks. So in simple terms, AO1 is showing that you understand what's happening, whether that's the plot, the characters, the themes, giving your own interpretations, so what you think is meant by this, and then backing up your ideas with quotations and references from the text, and then writing that in a clear and structured way. That's all we mean by AO1. So the example that I've used, and I've used arrows to tell you where these skills are, Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a deeply conflicted character whose ambition drives him towards murder. Already there, I've made a point, and I'm showing that I'm giving my interpretation of his character. At first, he recognizes that Duncan is a gracious king and admits that he has no spur except his vaulting ambition. So I've used quotes there to back up my argument, which shows he is aware of his immorality of his desires. This tension highlights Macbeth's inner struggle, making his eventual decision to kill Duncan even more shocking and tragic. And so I've given an explanation to my point. So AO1 is point and evidence. AO2 is terminology and explain. So AO2 is how you analyze language and structure used by the writer, and being able to say why those choices have been made and what the effects are. So in simple terms, AO2 is about zooming in on specific language and structural choices, using specific terminology and accurate terminology, and explaining why those choices were made and what the effects are, making sure it's relevant and linking back to the question. So following on from the example on the last slide, I said Shakespeare uses the metaphor of vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself, to suggest that ambition is dangerous and self-destructive. The verb overleaps implies an uncontrollable force that goes too far, reflecting how Macbeth's desire for power will keep him from overstepping moral boundaries and ultimately fall. Shakespeare also uses fricative consonants, where the repeated sound creates a harsh, forceful tone, emphasizing the destructive and violent nature of unchecked ambition to foreshadow Macbeth's fall, presenting it as inevitable. This image warns the audience about the consequences of ambition spiraling out of control and establishes tension to enable a greater sense of later catharsis in Act 5. So notice here, I've highlighted in red the key bits of terminology. So these are the language and structural devices that we've covered time and time over. Please learn them. Um, and then in yellow, I've put the explanation. So explaining why these metaphors, the fricative consonants, the tone, the foreshadowing, why they've been used and what effect that they have. Because it's one thing to just say Shakespeare has used these techniques. But what gets you the higher marks is being able to say why, what effect do they have? How do they make the audience feel? What would be different if they weren't there? So that's our 12 marks at AO2. So I've left a little thing here. Please analyze language and structure. You would be so shocked to how many answers I read of people who don't analyze language and structure. Please do, because it's 12 marks. If you don't analyze language and structure, that's 12 marks gone. And that's a hefty portion of your marks. Students, I blame the schools because I think students you're not taught this, and I think you should be. But students forget that they need to do this because it isn't English language. Just because it isn't English language doesn't mean we don't have to analyze language and structure. You still need to use terminology. You still need to explain the effects of why a certain word choices have been made. Please. This is how you make me feel when you don't use terminology. And I really want to hammer it home because last year I marked all the English. So if you sent any English homework in, it would have been marked by me, and you would be so shocked the amount of people that did not analyze language and structure. But please do that. And I've given you some examples to remind you of what these are, and we'll cover these again at a later date. But that's anything from euphemisms, alliteration, metaphor, epithets, juxtaposition, fricative consonants, symbolism, hyperbole, personification, repetition, allusion, consonants, oxymorons, dramatic irony, and the list goes on. Okay, AO3 then. This is our 6 marks. So we've given our points, we've given our quotes, we've explained them, we've given terminology. Now we need to link it to the context of the play. And we'll recap context in a second. But all context means is what was going on at the time that this play was written, and why is it important for our understanding of the play. So, showing understanding of the relationship between the text and the context in which they were written. We link the text to the time, the culture, the society. Except it's not just a history lesson. We're not just listing context for the sake of it. We're not just saying, oh, the play was written in 1605. Cool. Why? You can't just say a fact. You've got to then go one step further and explain why is that context important for the point that you're making? How does it change the interpretation of the character, of the quote, of the story? So I've given another example. In Jacobean England, ambition was seen as a dangerous quality because it could threaten the stability of the monarchy. Shakespeare highlights this in Macbeth's vaulting ambition, showing that his desire for power leads him to challenge the divine right of kings by murdering Duncan. To Shakespeare's audience, this would have been especially shocking, as regicide was not only a political crime but a sin against God. Therefore, the play reflects contemporary anxieties about ambition, leading to chaos and the disruption of the natural order, frightening them and acting as a moral message to overstep one's boundaries. And we'll cover the divine right of kings in a second. Finally, then, AO4. Now, it's worth mentioning that AO4 is only going to be assessed in Macbeth and Inspector Calls. You don't have to do it for the Victorian novel, and you don't have to do it for poetry. But it is in Macbeth and Inspector Calls, and it's only 4 marks. And it's assessing your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. So, using a range of vocabulary and sentence structures for clarity, purpose, and effect with accurate spelling and punctuation. Put simply, AO4 is about writing quality, not about what you say. It's about how well you express it. So have you written legibly? Is it understandable to the person who's marking it? Is it clear? Is it fluent? Have you used ambitious vocabulary? Have you used varied sentence structures? Have you spelt everything correctly? Have you used punctuation correctly, grammar correctly? And yeah, a little example with correct spag is Shakespeare presents violence as something that destroys both the body and the mind. After killing Duncan, Macbeth claims that all Neptune's great ocean could wash away the blood from his hands. The hyperbole here suggests that the act of regicide is so vast that it contaminates the natural world itself. The flowing rhythm of the line contrasts with the harsh plosive B in the noun blood, capturing both the scale and brutality of Macbeth's violence. I don't think much more needs to be said about AO4. Yeah, spell correctly, use punctuation correctly, use grammar correctly. You'll be fine. So, quick look at the chat. Is analyzing language and structure the same as analyzing a quote? Yes. It's just in schools, I find that they say analyzing quotes quite often, but they don't tell you what that means. It means analyzing language and structure, essentially. That's where you get the marks. So for Christmas Carol, I can just use normal words and not have to use ambitious vocabulary. Yeah, you don't get marked for AO4 for Christmas Carol. So yeah, the way you write does not matter in that particular essay. Okay, let's quickly look at a high versus a low scoring answer for this question. So here's the mark scheme. Level 6 is the highest you can get, 26 to 30 marks. So what they're looking for AO1, so our point and our evidence, they want a critical, exploratory, and conceptualized response. What they mean by that is, have you gone into detail? Have you given your own personal interpretations? Have you linked it to the rest of the play? Does it make sense? They've also wanted a judicious range of precise references. What that means by judicious is they want a wide range. They want you to link ideas. They want supporting quotes. So not just one quote, they want multiple quotes to support your point. AO2, so this is our terminology and our explanations. They want analysis of writers' methods with specific subject terminology, again, used judiciously. Again, they want accurate use of terminology. They want correct use of terminology. They want you to use a wide array of terminology. So not just mentioning personification, mentioning the consonants, the repetition. They want you to use a range of them, not just one. And then for the AO3, the context, it's exploration of ideas, perspectives, contextual factors shown by specific detailed links between context, text, and task. So in other words, have you used appropriate context to expand your point? Okay, so let's pretend this is the question. How is violence presented in Macbeth? Well, this is an example of one paragraph from an answer that if it was this quality the whole way through, I would say would get around 26. But this is a top scoring answer. So Shakespeare presents violence as an act that corrupts both the mind and the soul. There's our point, particularly through Macbeth's murder of Duncan. After killing, Macbeth describes his hands as a sorry sight and later insists that all great Neptune's ocean cannot wash the blood clean. Notice there, he hasn't just used one quote, they've used two quotes. This motif of blood symbolizes not only literal violence, but also the psychological stain of guilt that Macbeth cannot escape. So I've used terminology correctly, and I've begun to explain beyond the literal. The hyperbolic metaphor of an entire ocean being turned red emphasizes the scale of his crime, while the classical allusion to Neptune elevates Duncan's murder to a crime of cosmic significance, beyond ordinary human wrongdoing. Shakespeare also uses the plosive B sounds in blood to give the language of a brutal, jarring force, reflecting the inescapable and destructive nature of violence. So notice, I've linked it back to the question. I've talked specifically about violence because that's what it asked me about. For a Jacobean audience, the murder of a divinely appointed king would have been seen as an ultimate act of disorder, directly challenging the divine right of kings. By showing that no amount of water can cleanse Macbeth's guilt, Shakespeare warns the audience of the moral and spiritual consequences of committing violent acts against the natural and social order. So notice I've ticked off PTEC completely there. I've linked everything directly to the question, I've given detailed, conceptualized interpretations. I've used a wide range of quotes, and I've used a wide range of accurate terminology. Okay, what about a low scoring level 2 answer then? So instead of it being judicious, this time we've got as long as you've supported the response, so as long as you've answered something relating to the question, and you've commented on using a few quotes, then you get 6 to 10 marks of AO1. In AO2, as long as you've begun to analyze writers' methods, so you've maybe used a few bits of terminology and some reference to quotes, then you get 6 to 10 marks. In AO3, in context, as long as you've kind of briefly talked about context, you get 6 to 10 marks. But we don't want to be at this point. This is not where we want to be. And notice I've not even bothered putting on level 1 because you all are way better than level 1. I know you are because I read your writing. So I didn't even bother. I didn't even bother patronizing you at level 1. But we don't want to be we don't even want to be at level 2. We want to be above this. So for 6 marks, it would be someone would have written something like this. In Macbeth, violence is shown when Macbeth kills Duncan. After he has murdered him, Macbeth says that his hands are a sorry sight. This shows he feels bad about what he has done. Later, he says that not even Neptune's ocean could wash away the blood. This means he thinks that the murder is so big that he will never get rid of the blood. Shakespeare shows that violence makes Macbeth feel guilty. At the time of the play was written, killing a king would have been seen as very shocking. I mean, yeah, they've picked out 2 decent quotes. They've started to make some explanation. They've started to mention context. But notice here that I've not put any green or red on. There's not really an obvious point that's been made. And I think that's a problem because it's not clear to the reader. Equally, they're losing AO2 marks because they've not begun language analysis or structural analysis. They've used quotes, but they're not exactly judicious. They've not picked a wide range. In the last one, they did the full quotes. They did Neptune's ocean cannot wash the blood from clean. Whereas here they've just mentioned Neptune's ocean. It's not judicious. There's only a limited explanation. Like here, they've said he feels bad and that he thinks that he can't get rid of the blood. I mean, yeah, you're correct, but it's not beyond the literal. You've not gone into depth and looked beyond the obvious. And yeah, even in terms of context, they've only briefly linked it. And they've said it would be shocking. But why? Why would it be shocking? And how does that affect our interpretation of this quote? So I hope you can see there quite obvious difference between 26 and 6 marks. Okay, so that's it for going through the how to write an answer. Let's very quickly, for our last half an hour, 35 minutes, talk about what we did so far. Because I wish I could do it all again. But if you weren't here last year and you struggle with Macbeth, go onto our YouTube channel, find the recordings, or email Mr. Siddiqui about it and watch them. Because I go into a lot of detail about language analysis and context in Macbeth. And I help you to understand what the quotes mean and what they show us about characters and themes. But we've done so much that I can't cover it in half an hour. So I'm going to cover the very basics of what we've done. So far, we looked at Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3, specifically relating to the witches and then the character of Macbeth. So in Act 1, we looked at the introduction of Macbeth and how that is important for our understanding of his character. If you remember back, he's the first time we ever meet Macbeth. Actually, let me rephrase that. The first time we hear about Macbeth, he isn't even on stage. We hear about him first from other characters before we even meet him. Why is that structurally important? Because it tells us so much about his character without actually telling us anything about his character. He's introduced as a valiant soldier, and that's made very clear. He's described using the semantic field as worthy, a valiant. There's other words I can't remember, but he's described as a valiant soldier. And violence as a theme is presented as a very positive thing. He's hailed for his violence in war. But when we first actually meet him on stage, we see him encounter the witches, which again is a very important structural point because we never really see him before this story, if that makes sense. We never learn anything about him before this story. The first time we meet him, we're straight into the action. He's going to meet the witches. His life is being changed immediately. We never get to see the status quo of his life. We only get to see him when his life is changing. And so that's structurally very important. So he encounters the Weird Sisters, the three witches on the heath, and they give him prophecies that tell him he's going to be the Thane of Glamis, the Thane of Cawdor, and then the king. And that spurs him with ambition. But it opens up a debate. And I won't go too much into this now, but if you remember back, it opens up the debate of fate versus free will. Who's actually to blame for all of this? Is it Macbeth or is it the witches? Because the witches never tell him to kill anybody. They simply tell him he's going to be a king. So is it their fault? Or is it Macbeth's innate violent tendencies? Is it his innate desire for ambition, which drives him to madness? That's up to you to decide. In late Act 1, we see him struggle with morality. He doesn't want to kill Duncan at first. Lady Macbeth tries to get him to kill Duncan, but he doesn't want to do it. And it's Lady Macbeth that motivates him to change his mind. And we'll look at Lady Macbeth later down the line, because she challenges his courage by preying on his masculinity. She manipulates him by telling him he's not a man. And so that brings in our theme of gender. Okay, but then in Act 2, he actually goes ahead with the murder. He murders Duncan, showing his first act of violence as a corruptive force. Except his response to the violence is significant because he doesn't revel in the fact that he's done it. He actually feels very guilty about it, and he feels guilty very immediately. He gets taken over by paranoia, by physical hallucinations. He sees the dagger in front of him. Now, obviously, it's a debate as to whether the dagger is from the witches or whether it's a hallucination in his mind. That's up to you, your interpretation. I personally think it's a hallucination, and I think it shows his guilt and his paranoia. And it tells us something about his character. And then in Act 3, we see that his ambition begins to evolve into violence and tyranny as a villain as he becomes the king. He even starts to plan the death of his own best friend. So we see him begin to fall from a state of grace, in showing his increasing ruthlessness, his willingness to commit further violence without hesitation. And he begins to lose control of his own conscience, relying very heavily on manipulation and secrecy. And we saw that from the fact that when Macduff discovers the bodies, Macbeth outwardly lies to him. And it's very important. Now, when we left off here. We finished Act 3, Scene 2. And I wanted to re-highlight this quote to you because I think it's a very important point that we've left off. So we looked at the quote, "Things bad begun make themselves strong by ill." And I thought it was actually coincidentally quite a significant quote to have finished on. Because the last time we saw Macbeth was he'd entered into a cycle of violence. And what he meant by this quote is once you started doing bad things, you have to do even worse things to protect yourself. So notice here, he views what he's doing as irreversible. He thinks that because he's murdered Duncan, he can't repent for his sins. He thinks, oh, I have to keep killing people in order to get what I want. I've started by killing people, so now I have to keep killing people. And so I thought that was quite a significant thing to stop on because it shows how violence is such a corrupting force. And it kind of brings us back onto that debate of fate versus free will. He was clearly overcome by ambition to begin with and was very easily manipulated by violence and by Lady Macbeth. But anyway, still to come this year. I'm sorry for being dramatic. I'm being quite dramatic about this, aren't I? But we didn't finish Act 3, Scene 4. I thought we did, but we didn't. Otherwise, I would have done that today. But yeah, we've got Act 3, Scene 4 to come. We've got the ghost of Banquo. We've got the main point of the play, the climax, some would argue. We've got Act 4, Scene 1 to come, where he sees the apparitions from the witches. And then we've got his inevitable downfall. So please return, because I'm excited to go through this. And I'm really excited for this year. I think it's going to be great. And I'm going to keep up the detail with everything that I was giving you last year. But because this is a session, we've got new people, I thought what better to do than recap our context. And I know it's boring, and I know it's only 6 marks, but it's such a vital thing in Macbeth. Because especially when we start looking at the later scenes, its context comes in quite heavily later down the line. So I think it's important that we recap it because it's been 6 weeks. So, the main themes of Macbeth. You could get asked about any of the themes that I've highlighted in white in your exam. The ones highlighted in white are the ones that could come up as exam questions. So they're worth revising. And as we go through the quotes, I tend to write on the bottom which themes they're linked to. So go back and look at my other videos to see, because I've organized them by theme. But these could come up in your exam. So ambition, power, fate versus free will, ambition / deception, violence, and guilt. Off the top of my head, only 2 of these have come up so far, and that's ambition and appearance versus reality. All the others haven't come up yet. So far, Macbeth has been very character driven as a question, so don't discount these because these could come up in your exam. I am quite shocked that violence and guilt has not come up yet. And that's not me telling you that it will, that's me saying I think there's a very strong possibility that violence and guilt could be this year's question. So I would get to revising those. Okay, so think about context then. Why is this play important about when and how it was written? Well, the first thing to focus on is the tragic genre itself. There are certain elements that define the genre of this play. And these are some really key terminology, bits of terminology that I think are worth remembering. So Macbeth himself is considered what we call a tragic hero. That is the main character of the play, a protagonist. He's someone that has to begin as noble. He has to begin on a high, and then he falls from that place of grace. He falls into a place of suffering. So what defines a tragic hero is that someone who starts off as being very likable, having a good personality, but actually in the end does something wrong that then leads to their suffering. And Macbeth is considered as one of those people because he falls into ambition. Now, the hamartia is a funny word. It means the protagonist's tragic flaw. So it's the thing that causes him to fall from grace. And in this case, it's ambition. Macbeth's ambition causes him to die in the end. It's what causes his death. The whole play is about ambition. Hubris. All it means is excessive pride. And I think Macbeth has a lot of excessive pride. You could argue as well that it's kind of his hamartia. That's up to you to decide. Peripeteia. It means a reversal of fortune. So it's the moment in the play where things go wrong, where the hero's fate becomes irreversible. Now, I would argue, and there is a debate for this, that the peripeteia of the play is Act 3, Scene 4. I think that's the moment where things become irreversible. Because up until that point, okay, he's murdered Duncan, yeah, he's lied to some nobles, but he could still repent for his sins, and I think that would be fine. I think he could go to jail and it would all be fine. But up until Act 3, Scene 4, that's when things become irreversible, and you see what I mean when we do it next week. A catastrophe, the final act of suffering. So that's when Macbeth dies at the end of the play. And then the catharsis is the feeling that the audience get of relief when they experience Macbeth's death. So Macbeth, we'll cover this in Act 5, but when Macbeth dies, the audience are supposed to feel relieved. We're supposed to feel, in a way, almost glad that he's dead. Not necessarily happy, but just glad because we feel relief that all of this suffering, all of the tension is over. So those are our key terms for our tragic genre. Okay, so remember back. Shakespeare did not come up with this story. I want to put that out right. Shakespeare, he may have written the play, but he did not come up with the story of Macbeth. The original story was written in a book called the Holinshed Chronicles. What Shakespeare did do was he changed the story. He didn't copy the story, he made some tweaks. So Macbeth is based on the original tale written in the Holinshed Chronicles, except Shakespeare adapts various aspects of the story to convey the moral message of the play in order to create tension, make it interesting. So one of the things that he changes is that he makes Macbeth more tyrannous. In the original story, Macbeth has a very happy rule. He rules for 17 years, very happily. People like him as a king. But in our version of the story, Macbeth becomes very violent very quickly. It doesn't take 17 years, it takes days. So the story is considerably sped up. And that's a choice. It's made on purpose. So when I talked about AO3 before, we need to say why it's important. What impact does it have on the play? Well, it's important because by presenting him as tyrannous, it highlights the moral message of the play, which is don't play with fire because you're going to get burnt. Don't overstep your place on the great chain of being, otherwise you're going to suffer for it. The audience are supposed to learn something from Macbeth's actions. And so by speeding it up and making him kill Duncan quicker, it emphasizes the speed and severity of the story. Similarly, in the original story, Banquo is actually a villain. He helps Macbeth to murder people. But in Shakespeare's version, Banquo is actually Macbeth's very calm best friend. He never murders anyone. He's like the ideal person. He's very kind, very benevolent. He's destined for the throne. And yeah, we like Banquo. But in Shakespeare's version, well, he's made to be kind for a reason. It gives Macbeth a foil. It gives someone to contrast to Macbeth. If Banquo wasn't there, there would be no opposite to Macbeth, if that makes sense. There needs to be a character who is directly opposite of Macbeth. Because again, it highlights the moral message. It makes the audience aware that Macbeth's crimes are bad. And you shouldn't kill people. You shouldn't overstep your place in the great chain. Banquo is the ideal citizen. He's the person that the audience should look up to, should follow. And then, yeah, Banquo is also depicted as someone who doesn't benefit from the throne. Whereas in Shakespeare's version, Banquo is destined for the throne, which again makes him contrast to Macbeth, who wants to be king. So it gives Macbeth an opportunity to kill his best friend, which also therefore exaggerates how bad Macbeth's crimes are. So these differences are very important because they change the meaning of the play considerably. Okay. The divine right of kings and the great chain of being, I've linked these as one because they're kind of in the same ballpark. If you think back, the divine right of kings is the belief that a king is chosen directly by God to rule the kingdom. And the king's authority comes directly from God, not from the people who he rules over. So to go against the king is not just a legal crime, it's a spiritual sin as well. And it will come with spiritual punishment. So when Macbeth kills Duncan, not only is it a legal crime because he stabbed him and killed him, but it's a religious sin against God as well. And so that explains why in the play, the world becomes disorientated. It becomes there becomes a lack of balance. You know, we begin to see strange weather, animals behaving weirdly. Macbeth dies in the end. And that all comes as a result of him breaking the great chain of being. He oversteps his place in society. He is not meant to be king. He wasn't chosen by God, but he forces his way into being a king and therefore has gone against God. And this would have shocked Shakespeare's audience, who believed that killing the king was a direct attack on God's plan. Macbeth's eventual downfall and torment reflect the belief that anyone who defies this divine order will be punished both spiritually and socially. Okay. Last year, we also did some sessions specifically about the witches. That's another thing. Witches could come up in the exam. They're a characters directly noted on the syllabus. So they can come up, but they haven't yet. So that's another thing to look out for. Now, it's no surprise, James I, the king at the time when this play was written, hated witches. He was fascinated by them. He found them very interesting, but he considered them to be in league with the devil. He thought they were evil. And he wrote a book on this in 1597, which he called Demonology. And it was a book in which he explained how witches were linked to Satan, they were sinful, and they were harmful to the church. Um, and the purpose of writing this book was to provide evidence, or what he called evidence, of witches and encourage people to carry out witch hunts. It was almost a way of justifying killing people that he thought were witches. And it had a significant impact, did this book, because witchcraft reports rose to 53%. And it led to the 1604 Act against conjurations, in which if you were found to be a witch, you could be legally killed. So it had a significant impact. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it is important for understanding the play. Obviously, the audience watching it have that negative association about witches. So the witches in the play are therefore innately seen as an evil force. So anything they do in the play is considered a negative, to have negative further implications for the character of Macbeth. The book instilled fear, reinforcing James's role as the divine chosen king in order to protect his kingdom. If we link it to the great chain of being, witches were seen to have broken the natural order. It was thought at the time that men and women had distinctive looks, they had distinct places in society, and these witches went against that. They were females who had manly features. They would have supernatural powers that were beyond human capabilities. And so he believed that they went against God, that they threatened social and cosmic stability. So he wanted them dead because he thought them existing would lead to chaos and consequences. So he thought if he killed all the witches, it would lead to a much happier and calmer and stable society. Now, there is a period within James I's history where he traveled to Denmark because he recently married a princess in Denmark, and he went to collect her on a boat journey. And whilst at sea, he underwent a very strong storm that almost killed him. Now, he believed that this was due to a supernatural attack by witches. He thought the witches were trying to kill him by drowning his boat. And it led to one of the greatest witch hunts in human history, in which, when he got returned to England, 70 witches were tried and killed. And that's significant because it shows the fear that he placed on society. Because he had this great influence. Now, in terms of why witches were included in the play in general, well, firstly, they appealed to the king. By portraying the witches as evil, Shakespeare attempts to flatter the king by aligning them with his views. This would have instilled the audience with fear, as it acted as further evidence of the consequences of dealing with the supernatural. That's the most obvious sort of answer, but there are other sort of deeper ones. So it also reflected societal fear. The witches are seen as a symbol, or they represent disorder. Witches in Macbeth embody chaos and temptation, and the breakdown of the natural order, all of which were deeply feared by the audience of the time. Their influence over Macbeth suggests that even the strongest can fall prey to evil. And so it highlights the moral message of the play, that these witches were able to corrupt Macbeth. And so the audience don't want to succumb to the same fate as Macbeth. It's almost presenting the idea that instilling fear in the audience by saying, don't stray from your place in the great chain of being, otherwise chaos will come. And so it keeps the audience in their place. And it also serves a dramatic purpose. The witch is set to the opening tone of the play, immediately creating a dark and ominous atmosphere to foreshadow the events of the play. They also propel the plot by manipulating Macbeth and opening a debate for the extent of fate versus free will, and they serve as a moral warning to symbolize the dangers of listening to evil forces. Now, there is one more change made in the Holinshed Chronicles, specifically to do with the witches. Now, in the original story, the witches, and I don't want to go too much into detail of this, but the witches were supposed to be the Fates. Now, anyone who knows a lot about Greek mythology will know that the Fates had quite a lot of influence over human lives, over people's stories, over the trajectory of people's lives. Except in Shakespeare's version, the witches were presented as rather than being a sort of factor that, how to word this, they were presented more as dark and sinister compared to the original Fates that weren't really sinister. And there's a reason for this. By changing them and making them into sinister beings, it plays on the audience's fears about breaking that great chain. But it also limits their power. The Fates, or the original Greek Fates, had a great influence over humanity. Whereas in this story, the witches don't. The witches can't force Macbeth to do anything, but they can influence him to do things. And so by limiting their power, it gives Macbeth choice and agency. And again, that's so important because it highlights the moral message of the play. Again, as you'll notice, I'm going to keep saying this because all of these changes are there to tell the audience to not overstep their boundary in the great chain of being. It's to instill the audience with fear, convey the moral message. By giving Macbeth choice, it opens the debate of, is it humanity's fault or is it the supernatural? So it shows that Macbeth is responsible for his actions, or at least could be responsible for his actions. So the purpose of that change is to emphasize the psychological consequences of overstepping ambition. Okay, right. Couple more slides then, and then we're done. Two more things to go through. Religion. Religion comes up a lot in Macbeth. We've seen, I think, I used a quote about Neptune's ocean towards the start of the session. That is an example of religious illusion. So for anyone who is new and hasn't come across the term illusion before, I know this was something that was not common when I taught it last year. Illusion is when you refer to something that everybody knows. So if I was to allude to the Bible, for example, I'd be linking to the Bible. So when Macbeth says all the great Neptune's ocean, he's alluding to or referring to the great god Neptune, who was the god of the sea. And so allusion plays a vital part in conveying subtext to the audience, conveying things beyond the literal to the audience, so that we learn something. So religious allusions are where Shakespeare uses biblical references to add depth to characters. Throughout the play, we find quite a lot of references to the Garden of Eden and the snake in the Garden of Eden. That's a good example of religious allusion, is linking to the snake. Because we all know this, that we associate the snake as being deceptive, as being evil. And so that tells us something about the character that's being linked to the snake. Protestant audiences interpreted stories personally, reinforcing moral lessons. So that's a bit of history for the time. James I was Protestant. He took over from the previous Queen Elizabeth, who was Catholic. A quick difference between Protestants and Catholics is that Protestants believe more in moral lessons. And so that's important for the play. As I keep saying to you, the whole point is to tell the audience a moral lesson. There's also predestination versus free will. So that's the debate over whether Macbeth's downfall is due to the witches and fate or his own choices. And that highlights tension between the divine plan and human agency. And then finally, forgiveness. It's important to note that Macbeth never repents for his sins. He accepts that he is damned, making his fall eternal. And again, that teaches a sort of moral lesson against God. Sorry, going against God leads to irreversible consequences. Okay, finally then, you'll notice I've left off gender, but that is another contextual point that could come up, but we'll talk about that more when we look at Lady Macbeth. But the last one that I want to go over is the four humours. And this is not something that comes up often in the play, but it's certainly something that comes up in vital importance when it does. So if you aren't aware, back in the 15 and 1600s, We didn't really know that much about the human body and how it worked. So, what physicians believed at the time was that human behavior was controlled by the balance between four different bodily fluids. And they believed that if these four fluids were in balance, a person was healthy. And if they were not balanced, it would lead to illness or madness, depending on which fluid was out of balance. Now, the four are blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And each one is associated with a different human characteristic. So, blood is someone who's optimistic, who's outgoing, who's social, who's happy. Yellow bile is anger, ambition. Black bile is sadness, introspection. And phlegm is calm and unemotional. Now, places this comes up, Macbeth is referenced as having an excess of yellow bile. He's got lots of ambition and lots of anger. Or he develops yellow bile, I should say. He didn't start with ambition and anger, he develops it. He also has an excess of black bile. And we know this because the way that he responds to Duncan's death is guilt and paranoia. He has hallucinations. Lady Macbeth quite literally criticizes him when she tells him that he's too full of the milk of human kindness. This on the outset might not seem as related to the four humours, but milk is a direct reference to the four humours. What she means by milk is blood. She means that Macbeth has got too much blood and he lacks yellow bile. So what she's saying to him is that he's too optimistic, he's too social, he's too happy, and he's not ambitious enough. So that's what she means when she says that to him. Lady Macbeth also has references to the four humours. She has also an excess of black bile. She's melancholic and she's ruthless. She literally seeks to unsex herself, turning milk, again, she references milk, which means blood, into gore, which means bile. So that becomes a metaphor for abandoning her natural balances, her optimism, her happiness, and turning it into anger and ambition. And we'll cover that more when we do Lady Macbeth. But the key idea is that Shakespeare uses the humours to show psychological consequences of ambition and transgression against the natural order. So the four humours is sort of a key contextual point because it links to gender, it links to the Great Chain, it links to the Divine Right of Kings, it links to the character changes in the Hollington Chronicles. It's something that links to a lot of other ones. Okay, right. That's our recap done. What I plan for the next 5 weeks, and I know 5 weeks is a lot that we've got left of Macbeth. It wouldn't have been so much if I'd have finished it last year. We need to do Act 3, Scene 4. So next week we're going to have a look at Act 3, Scene 4, and we're going to look at Act 4, Scene 1. And then we're going to finish character of Macbeth, looking at Act 5 the week after. And we're then going to look at Lady Macbeth specifically. But I want to leave Macbeth there because I've given you all the themes and I've linked all the quotes to themes. I've given you plenty of analysis, plenty of context, and I've really gone to town with this. So yeah, I want to leave Macbeth there. I am going to cover other texts. So I was going to ask you tonight, which ones do you want me to cover first? Because I want to know what people want before I start planning it. I can do all the texts. The only one, and I'm going to make this clear now, is I will not be doing a Christmas Carol. So any of the others, I am very happy to do. Jacqueline Hyde, poetry, Inspector Calls. We're going to do unseen poetry. We're going to do some more language throughout the year. But yeah, I want to know what people want next, and then I can start planning. So, quick look at the chat. When will I do Inspector Calls? I can do it whenever. I don't mind. That's up to you guys. So, you know fate versus free will. Can you say that maybe he would have become king like the prophecies, like the witches said, without doing anything? Because he became Thane of Cornwall without doing anything. How would you word that? That is up to interpretation. Yes, you could argue that it is the witch's fault. You could say it is fate, and that if he hadn't have done anything, he still would have become king. We can't argue against that. There's no evidence against that. But that's up for debate. Was it worth him going out of his way to kill all those people? I don't know. It's up to you. Like, would he have ruined his own fate? Possibly. Possibly. Maybe that's what you're supposed to learn in the play. That's the moral message of the play. The fact that he went against the great chain, the fact that he underwent that change in ambition, was that what caused his downfall? Maybe if he did nothing, he still would have become king. We don't know. But the fact that he did those terrible things, that he chose to murder, that he chose to follow his ambition, is free will what caused his death in the end? That's up for you to decide. I think personally, yes, but that's up for you to decide. Okay, which characters can definitely come up in the exam? Okay, I want to put this out there right now. I will list them for you. Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, The Witches, Banquo. You ain't going to get anything else. Those are the ones that are named on the AQA syllabus. You will not get anything about Malcolm, not about Duncan. Possibly Macduff, but I don't think there's enough to write about Macduff in order to warrant a full question. But those are the four that will or could come up for you. Is the Holinshed Chronicles going to be asked about in the exams? Not explicitly, but it is very useful to have. You'll never get asked about context as a question. You just have to link context. But I think it's important because the Holinshed Chronicles is, changes were made to the original story for a reason. And is that not the point of the 6 marks of context? To say changes that were important? I am getting a mix of answers about what to do. The one that I'm getting the most here seems to be an Inspector Calls. So if that's the one people want next, I will do Inspector Calls next. I'm going to cover them all throughout the year, but I just want to get planning. Okay, I will do Inspector Calls next. Decided, let's do it. So yeah, very quickly before I finish then, I don't know if you were here for the last session, but I made it very clear to my Key Stage 3 students that homework is going to become a bigger thing. That's not from me. That's what I've been asked to do for you. I was a bit slack with homework last year. I kind of didn't really give you any, and if I did, I was very lax about it. But yeah, it will become a bigger thing. I'm not going to do it this week because it was a recap session. But yeah, unfortunately, it's going to become a bigger thing. And yeah, I really encourage you to do the homework. I know it's not nice, but yeah. And other than that, you are free to go. And I hope you have a lovely summer, and I hope you have a lovely year because you're going to be seeing more of me about. Is it possible? I'll stay around for a couple of minutes, by the way, to answer any questions if you need. Is it possible to do a few lessons on A Christmas Carol? The reason I didn't want to do A Christmas Carol is I'm going to be honest with you. I have never read the book. I have studied all the others and I've never studied A Christmas Carol. And so I don't feel like it would be appropriate for me to teach it. That's the reason. I'm being really honest with you. I obviously know the story, but I've never studied the book intensely. Like I've never actually analyzed the book. So whereas all the others, I have. So yeah, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'll stay around for a couple more minutes. If, and I will put this out as a little disclaimer, if there are lots of people who are doing Christmas Carol, I could try and attempt to study it later in the year, but I would need to go away and do it and study it because I haven't. So if that's something that loads of people are doing, that it warrants then I possibly could do that. Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, yeah, will Macbeth come up in year 10 mocks? That depends on your school. I don't know what your school is doing for mocks. If that's what you're learning first, yes. But if you've not started Macbeth yet, then I would assume not. But that's not something to ask me. That's something to ask your teachers at school, because we don't assess English language literature here. We just do these as extra sessions. But I actually might argue for it. So cool. Right. If there's no more questions, have a lovely week. Yeah. And I will see you next time.